Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I can honestly say I haven't felt this sense of overwhelming hopefulness since last year's march in Washington, D.C. So thank you, thank you. Today in Pennsylvania, there are 88,000 grandparents parenting 195,000 grandchildren. And those are the cases that we know about. This statistic reflects only a facet of the interrelated problems facing the most vulnerable and at-risk members of our society, our children. These problems fall disproportionately on the shoulders of women. I'm the guardian ad litem in Jefferson County, which makes me the attorney that represents all of the kids that come through the foster care system in Jefferson County. And I've been doing this work since 2004. I was also chair of the Juvenile Court Procedural Rules Committee of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for a number of years. And I also train other attorneys across the Commonwealth who represent foster children. I'd like to tell you about this interrelated problem through the stories of some of the women that I've met. Let's first talk about Jane. Jane and her husband and 2 kiddos lived in one of the northern tier counties in Pennsylvania, and they rented a small apartment for about $500 a month. The Marcellus gas wells came in, and the demand for housing skyrocketed, and their landlord told them that their rent would cost $1,200 a month. They bought a camper. They moved out to a campsite. It was early spring. Jane couldn't walk to work anymore. Jane lost her job, but they made it work. Winter came. Someone called the Children and Youth Services. The kids are cold. They can't live in a camper for winter. Everyone agreed. Jane and her husband as well, and they were placed with a foster family close by, and they visited often. And then there was a medical emergency in the foster family's home. The only family that could take those children lived over an hour away. The visits became more infrequent. The visits became harder. CYS started using words like permanency and termination and involuntary. And they followed through, and the parents' rights were terminated. Jane and her husband had an intact family. There were no issues of drug or alcohol abuse. There were no issues of abuse or neglect. They were just too poor for too long. Second woman I want to tell you about, her name was Pat. And Pat is a hero in my eyes. She was a foster mother in Jefferson County for a number of years. But Pat didn't just foster children. She fostered families. She invited moms into her home, and they would sit at the dinner table and clip coupons, and she'd help them make grocery lists and a budget, and she'd take them to the grocery store and then come home and help make dinner for their children, and at the end they'd clean up and one would wash and one would dry. Pat recognized that most of the parents of the children that she cared for never had a foundation in parenting. Most of them hadn't been parented themselves. She had the highest family reunification rate in our county. Pat did more for the families than any government ever would. She found the good in every one of those parents, and she loved them unconditionally, just as she did every child that came through her home. And that support, I really believe, gave a lot of those people the strength to become successful families. Lastly, I'd like to tell you about Florence. Florence and her husband worked their entire lives and scrimped and saved to retire. And their dream was to buy a Harley Davidson and drive across the country together. Shortly before launch date, CYS showed up at their door with their 2 grandchildren, 5 and 3, in tow. Their daughter had overdosed on heroin and was currently detoxing in the county jail. Would they take the kids? Of course, they took their grandchildren. But suddenly retirement was no longer on the very near horizon. Florence and her husband are very proud people. They never took a dime from the government. They did it on their own. But they found themselves navigating a system trying to get their grandchildren dental care, eyeglasses, vaccinations. They both went back to work. Their daughter got clean. She got out of jail. She moved home. Things were good for a few weeks, maybe a month. And then their daughter started coming home later and later. And one day the 3-year-old was looking through mommy's purse for a toy, and he pulled out a syringe. There was never a cross-country trip on a Harley Davidson for Florence. These three stories have a common thread. These are the stories of our sisters who are struggling. These are mothers who lack parenting skills, mothers who are struggling with drug and alcohol addictions, mothers who are just poor. Foster moms with hearts as big as oceans, and grandparents sacrificing their golden years to care for their grandchildren. But what is to be done about this? First and foremost, we know we should all be less judgmental. We should volunteer more. We should donate more. And we know we should remember that all of us are probably luckier than most. But it's not enough. We must all become advocates, which I think we're already on a pretty good start, right? I'm asking you to be an advocate for these children in our system. And if we want to help children in our foster care system, the federal government must commit to supporting and funding all of the programs that our struggling families need to survive. These include, and I'm going to list them, the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or formerly food stamps, Title I funding that helps schools care for and educate poorer kids, Head Start and other preschool programs, addiction recovery programs, programs for the survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and finally, programs that foster whole families. This is our social safety net, and it's fraying at the edges, and it's our obligation to make sure that it's mended. It must be mended. But for that to happen, all of you must become advocates. You need to call and email your senators. You need to call and email your congressmen. And you need to tell them that you're tired of short-term budget deals. 1 month, 5 days, and none of them do anything real. You need to tell them that you want them to do the jobs they were elected to do. You need to tell them that giving tax cuts to billionaires does not entitle them to further deprive children that have already been deprived enough already. Children are our future. But to build a better future for them, all of us must become advocates. And we need to advocate for our sisters. We need to advocate for our children. And we need to advocate for our nation. Thank you for having me.